The subject of the lesson is matter, and the golden text has some very important words in it that are going to reappear in the rest of the lesson, have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. We're going to get the sense of myth very strongly being answered in the lesson, and the irreverent quality of mortal mind, and the silliness of believing of life in matter. And then, of course, the right direction, rather train yourself for godliness. Responsive reading is a very rich part of the lesson. We have that wonderful verse from Isaiah 40, to prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. And then that one verse that has always intrigued me, every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill shall be made low, crooked be made straight, rough places plain. So it's the turning upside down entirely the world of matter, our perception foisted on us by mortal mind. And the promise is, as Jesus did, that silly myth will be turned upside down. That's what Jesus did. He took us from myth to reality. Verses 5 and 6, and in turning the matter myth upside down, and other ways destroying it, then our perception will be the true perception of God as everywhere. Then, of course, there's the description of a matter, mortal mind world as the withering, fading, and in opposition, God's spiritual nature, the world and all, God shall stand forever. Some nice vocabulary in verse 15 to try to contrast these two perceptions. The nations, as we perceive them as nations, are a drop of a bucket. I love that expression. And are small dust. A very good way to describe mortal mind and its lie, matter. And then the lovely uplift at the end of the responsive reading. Sing unto the Lord a new song, and his praise from the end of the earth. This singing unto the Lord a new song is our joy in recognizing the reality of our spiritual nature, because we recognize God as all in all and as spirit. And it continues, verse 10, and his praise from the end of the earth, ye that go down to the sea, and all that is therein, the isles and the inhabitants thereof. A lovely two close clauses that try to show you that God's spiritual nature, God is spirit, and we are our idea, covers the whole earth, the whole universe, covers infinity, and the way that they often talk about that is over land and sea, because the sea covers so much of our planet, and then the rest of it, the isles and the inhabitants thereof, completes the idea of a complete world that is entirely spiritual. The wonderful results of going from unreality to reality. I will bring the blind by a way they knew not. Here's the turning upside down again. And the turning upside down turns out to be healing. I will lead them in paths that they have not known. I will make darkness light, crooked things straight. And then a very important end to that verse 16. These things will I do unto them and not forsake them. The sense of love. There is unbounded love for us as idea. Comes in, I think, with that very last statement, and not forsake them. All that really exists is the divine mind and his or her communication with his idea constantly. And that communication is love. So I just think it's a very rich golden text and responsive reading. And I've sensed in doing the rest of the lesson, the carryover, which is of course supposed to happen, is very clear from these two readings, golden text and responsive reading. So let's look at the carryover. In section 1, we have the wonderful statement from John and from Genesis. In the John statement, I think most of us replace beginning with in the forever. Was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In my sense of things, that Word with God, Word was God, is the ever-presence of the Christ from the very beginning, the manifestation of God to us through the Christ was from the very beginning. Some of my colleagues in other Christian sects interpret the Word was God, and they put Jesus in there. And therefore, they say that Jesus was God. And I feel very comforted by recognizing that Mrs. Eddy has defined Jesus as worthy of the Christ title, but was not the Christ that was from the very beginning. His nature within was, but he took a human form, and as such could not have been God. That would be the beginning of a myth. But in our understanding of who Jesus was and his nature and our nature, that's the beginning of the end of a myth. That there is life and power and existence in matter. Okay. So section 1 Bible gives us the solid foundation of Genesis 1. Then the science and health part of section 1, we begin to see the vocabulary of the golden text and the responsive reading, or the perception therein beginning to show up. In citation 2, all the objects of God's creation reflect one mind, and whatever reflects not this mind is false and erroneous. And I've written down as a synonym for false and erroneous the big myth, the myth of life in matter. And then Mrs. Eddy has that very interesting citation at number 6 is something like a scientific proof that although there is light suggested, the sun did not yet appear, and yet there was light. All questions as to the divine creation, being both spiritual and material, are answered in this passage. For those solar beings are not yet included in the record of creation, still there is light. So light there is spiritual reality. And then myths begin, or mythical begins to appear in a very important passage. 4. Let there be light is the perpetual demand of truth and love, changing chaos into order and discord into the music of the spheres. The mythical human theories of creation, anciently classified as the higher criticism, sprang from cultured scholars in Rome and Greece, but they afforded no foundation for accurate views of creation by the divine mind. Now, because I taught Latin and classical literature, I had to dig quite deeply into myths of the ancient world. And though there is some beauty, certainly, there is wisdom if you dig down deeply enough. But it still has its basis in a life in matter, mortal man as worthy of being something like a god in the attention we give him. And it is one of the examples that Mrs. Eddy has given elsewhere of the education of the pharaohs, the idea in the ancient world that power and right exist in matter, particularly powerful matter, namely material gods and kings. The final part of section 1 is, I believe, another statement of sing a new song. It's at the end of line 9. The first chapter of Genesis puts man in the hands of God, not of man, in keeping of spirit, not matter, joyfully acknowledging now and forever God's supremacy, omnipotence, and omnipresence. That's the new song we sing when we recognize what the true reality is. And we sing that song unto the Lord by reflecting God, by knowing that that's what we are. And the line from the manual came to me in the rule for motives and acts, that we, as idea, operate in true brotherliness, charitableness, and forgiveness. That's our real song to the Lord, our gratitude to the Lord, by demonstrating what our God is in our own lives. Section 2. I think it was wonderful that almost the entire section is devoted to beauty. I have always felt a wonder at that expression, the beauty of holiness, that that's the real basis of untrammeled and eternal beauty, which of course speaks to old age. It speaks to any deformity. It is just a wonderful expression, the true basis of beauty as holiness. And then the rest of that section amplifies why beauty is eternal. And I think that's so important. The expression, for example, section 2, citation 6, the radiance of soul. We have so much advertising for makeup, for exercise, for all treatments of the body in order to produce beauty, with the body looked at as a real existence governed by a mortal mind. And it has produced an awful lot of disappointment in the pleasures that are sought for beauty. And it is an industry of great proportions in our country and around the world to produce beauty by the manipulation of the body instead of through the radiance of soul. And it is a silly myth. Here's the continuity, that beauty exists in matter. Mrs. Eddy says it quite clearly. The embellishments of the person are poor substitutes for the charms of being, shining resplendent and eternal over age and decay. She just has the most wonderful vocabulary to express the difference between the matter world and the true world of spirit. Let's see. But what's our job in this understanding of beauty? Our job is to look at our fellow man as governed by immortal mind and therefore beautiful. We need to perceive our fellow man as spiritual beauty and idea, that they too will see us as spiritual, beautiful, untouched by silly myths. So we have a very clear statement of what beauty of spirit must enter into our lives in practicing Christian Science. In section 3, the word song appears again. The Lord will command his loving kindness in the daytime, and in the night his song shall be with me, and my prayer unto the God of my life. The song of the Lord, and the same new song that we sing, is the rejoicing in our spiritual nature. The third section, I have written here that what it talks about mostly is the individuality of God's man, of the idea that we are. We are the idea of mind and love and spirit. We are the expression of God. And we are not absorbed into any other entity. We are individual ideas. And the reason that word I've written large at the top of the story of Daniel is that in my study of the classics and Roman and Greek history, the Eastern potentates, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Darius, and even Xerxes, who all attacked and overcame. Well, Xerxes didn't. He tried it, but the Battle of Marathon put him to rest. But all these Persian or Babylonian Eastern potentates represent the kind of matter is powerful. Matter is, and its so-called creator, mortal mind, is might that makes right, and was known in history as the Eastern threat to the Western thought of individuality. And I think the story of Daniel brings that out. What's interesting to me is the attitude of Darius toward Daniel, for he had placed him in a place of honor, recognized his intelligence and what he could do as an administrator in Darius's kingdom. But, and I see that as what I see more and more as I study, that the Christ was operating in the Old Testament. We have to recognize that because it is eternal. Now, Jesus certainly expressed the Christ most compellingly, but the Christ didn't start with Jesus, because in the forever was the Word. And we have to know that our spiritual existence and our understanding of that has to accept that the Christ has been forever, and that we can see the truth about God is what I'm defining the Christ as, appearing in the Old Testament, even in the Eastern potentates. For example, though Darius yielded to those jealous courtiers who got Daniel put to the lion's den, but if you read the whole story with none of the verses left out, we see that the king did not want to put Daniel into the lion's den. But when he had, in a fit of pride, signed that document according to the law of the Persians and the Medes, he had to do it. But when, in verse 16, Daniel was cast into the den of lions, Darius said, "Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee." And then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Now, oh dear, I didn't bring. Can you hold a minute? Because here, maybe I can get it from my notes. In the verse 14, which is not included in here, the king set his heart on Daniel to save him. And in 18, after he had cast him into the lion's den, his sleep went from him, and he was awake all night. I guess we could say praying, or at least worrying about Daniel. And then, of course, 23, then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. And we know that later on, Darius makes a statement that all should recognize the God of Daniel. Of course, he also threw the courtiers and their families to the lions, which is not a particularly ugly. Oh, yeah. Yeah, he threw them and the children of the courtiers. Now, see, that's his Eastern potentate. Power comes from might, from violence. But in there, from his position, and this is true of all of the, Nebuchadnezzar was the time of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the recognition there of the fourth person in the fire as an angel. It was working even in those times among these potentates that are the essence of a mortal mind world. But it was being alleviated, not constantly or regularly, but at times. And prophets represented that truth about God as being the more powerful. So the reason I put individuality as what this is talking about is that the definition of the Eastern potentates was the great societies that they built up that crushed one's individuality and made it servant to the state. And so our individuality as eternal ideas of God expressing himself is a complete and wonderful expression of true individuality, as opposed to the potentates or the Eastern thinking that crushed individuality and still does crush individuality under the demands of the state, rather than uplift individuality, express individuality as ideas of the only power, God, mind, love. For section 3, I've underlined, this is all about life, God as life. And her strong statement that matter is a human concept is kind of a rewording of the silly, irreverent myth that we talk about in the opening of the lesson. And the myth is to believe that man is ever in a finite form, or God in a finite form, which appears in citation 12. Then she speaks of the saving of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fiery furnace, Daniel from the jaws of the lion. And then she adds what she stresses in every page of the biography of Christian healer: can heal the sick in every age and triumph over sin and death. That's our job to see. It's interesting, too, that citation 14, let us rejoice, there's our song again, that we are subject to the divine powers that be. That expression of, and it's put in quotations here, powers that be, always refers to some vague, o'erweening power like fate or a potentate or something. And here she has, we are subject to the divine, quote, powers that be. Such is the true science of being. Okay? And we are also not governed by the irreverent and silly myths of mortal existence. Section 4, intelligence is not in matter, is the o'erweening sense of this. Okay, just a few comments. That mortal mind would try to shrink the Christ to a mortal personality. This is about Jesus in Nazareth, and they're saying over and over again, is this not the Joseph's son? What he was teaching them was so overwhelmingly truthful, pouring down upon them, but they tried to put it in a mortal context that, in fact, isn't Jesus just Joseph's son? How can he know all this? The section in John brings that out again. And the Jews marveled, saying, how knoweth this man letters, having never learned? And Jesus answered them and said, my doctrine is not mine, but he that sent me. For we are ideas of mind, and thus have his intelligence. In this particular section, I have referred in my study several times to an article in the Anthology 1 of Classic Articles by Paul Stark-Seeley. It is called Perception, and it's on page 82, and it's written by Paul Stark, whose writing is so very clear. But he opens his rather lengthy article on perception. A physical scientist has stated that the human eye perceives but 1/40,000 millionth. I'm going to repeat that. 1/40,000 millionth part of the material universe. How inadequate, then, is this physical organ as a medium for reliable information? By far the greater part of what is taking place in the temporary so-called material universe, the eye never sees. And it takes no note at all of the permanent spiritual universe, no note at all of divine mind. Says Paul, I have not seen nor ear heard the things which God has prepared for them that love him. Where then is that perceptive capacity to be found that acquaints us with God and his work? Then the rest of the article is a wonderful destruction of the silly myths that are mentioned in the lesson. God is referred to by Mrs. Setti, I'm reading from Perception, as the all-seeing. Whence is the seeing activity of God taking place? That is like asking, where is the life that God expressed? Or where is the love that is God made evident? God mind has one and only one mode of expression, namely his ideas. And that puts us right into what our real life is and the perception necessary for us to see that. It's a wonderful article. I just don't want to read more of it because it makes this process too long. Section 4, intelligence is stress. As I had just said, I'm getting back to the Jews wanting to know why Jesus knows so much. And he says, I just know what my Father says. And they are the signs of the time when believing in mortal mind and matter, the audience, the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, could not discern the signs of the times. You can discern the face of the sky, but can you not discern the signs of the times? And of course that is the truth of spiritual. Now let's see, I think I've talked about the perception article, and that mind, the only activity going on is mind talking to itself. That's a funny way of putting it, but communicating with itself, and itself is idea. The word mythologies shows up again in the Science and Health section of Section 4. The very doctrines and theories which presuppose life and intelligence to exist in matter are so many ancient and modern mythologies. Now we tend to think, well, ancient mythologies, yes, Greeks and Romans and Persians, and they all had their sense of mythology and relationship to gods in mythology. But she puts in modern mythologies, which of course is silly lie of mortal mind. And very strong closing to Section 4. She just says, I therefore plant myself unreservedly on the teachings of Jesus, of his apostles, of the prophets, and on the testimonies of the science of mind. Okay. Section 5, truth is the major capitalized idea, destroying the myths of matter and bringing reality alive. Okay, and this is the healing. Mrs. Eddy, throughout the earlier section, and in fact in all her writings, if we are to, healing is singing a new song. And the bowed woman could now sing a new song and live in the reality of the joy of the, as the Bible says, the glorious things that were done by Jesus. And in Science and Health, let's see. Oh, the Science and Health reminded me of an article that is in this week's Sentinel. This week's Sentinel is called September 17th Sentinel. It came just the other day. And its entire title is The One Ego. And there was an article that was very interesting and very reassuring. It's by Channing Walker, and it's titled Humiliated or Humbled and Healed. And he spoke of an instance in which he had done an awful job in a speech he had to make, and he felt humiliated. But he prayed about it, and he recognized that the only position he can take of being down is the position of humble before his God, on his knees before his God. And then he does a wonderful review of how Jesus was humiliated constantly. Isn't he just the son of Joseph, and physician, heal thyself, and scourged and just knocked as low as possible. But because he knew he was the beloved of God, he took that into prayer and humbled himself before his God, thus reminding himself, and it should remind all of us, that humility is not humiliation. It is strength. And, as the title says, humiliated or humbled and healed. And of course, Jesus was able to resurrect. There is a quote that runs alongside the article from Mary Baker Eddy, page 281 of Science and Health. The one ego, the one mind or spirit called God, is infinite individuality, which supplies all form and comeliness, there's beauty, which reflects reality and divinity in individual spiritual man and things. So there we have individuality, we have beauty, we have reality, and our definition of us as spiritual man and all the universe. So, the last section, which I know you'll remind me it exists if I don't do it. Let's see. Okay. This must be important. I read it. In the Old and New Testament, truth is depicted as destroying the false report, which is mentioned in 6. Thou shalt not raise a false report. Keep thee far from a false matter. There are those silly myths again. reminding us, and that comes from Exodus, very early on. And that false report is of matter as the basis of life. And then from the New Testament, Paul's great statement, for in him we live and move and have our being. This is a kind of summary section that takes us back over the first 5 and over the golden text and responsive reading and summarizes it. You can see it as you go through. There's the false report that certainly is the matter world discussed earlier. And then it has our job in relationship to this real world. Our job is in citation 25, to divest thought of false trusts and material evidences in order that the spiritual facts of being may appear. This is the great attainment by means of which we shall sweep away the false and give place to the true. And this is her last statement. As the mythology of pagan Rome has yielded to the more spiritual idea of deity, so will our material theories yield to spiritual ideas until the finite gives place to the infinite, sickness to health, sin to holiness, and God's kingdom comes in earth as it is in heaven. It's a wonderful lesson. And